Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 334, The Great Hiatus. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, you remember the old Karnak bit where Johnny Carson would discern the answers and then ask the questions after opening the envelope?
I do remember that, yes.
And one of the answers was hiatus. And the question is, what do you say when you meet an atus? Well, we're about to meet an atus today in the form of the Great Hiatus.
The Great Hiatus.
That time that Sherlock Holmes took between taking his leave of Watson and the world at the Reichenbach Falls and returning to London for the untimely death of Ronald Adair, perpetrated by one Colonel Moran. And we have, this is our monthly feature, it's called Master's Class, and in this case, we are I think this is the second entry in the Edgar Smith quarter. We're doing 3 Edgar Smith pieces here. And you can go back and listen to the 3 episodes we did about Trevor Hall and his classic scholarship. But that's what we're doing. We're taking a remarkable or particularly exemplary piece of Sherlockian scholarship and revisiting it and commenting on it ourselves and bringing it to life once again. So in the Baker Street Journal, Volume 1, Number 3, Edgar Smith, who was the editor of the journal at the time, talked about Sherlock Holmes and what he was doing during the Great Hiatus. And it's a wonderful piece of scholarship, and I think we'll have some pointed opinions about it as well. Just a note, if you would like to get the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles334. All lowercase. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site, where you can be sure to click on the links and other associated episodes, and maybe even decide to support us on Patreon. We do love your support and appreciate it. And all of our Patreon supporters are eligible for a drawing we do every month for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and a free drawing that we do every quarter for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. We'll be doing that in the very next episode, so make sure you go to our Patreon link there, or just patreon.com/trifles, and become a supporter for as little as $1 a month, whatever you feel you can afford, and we would be forever grateful. Well, Bert, we are going to take ourselves into the heady world of expert scholarship. How do you want to begin this discussion that Edgar sets up for us?
Well, I think we can begin by just diving into Sherlock Holmes and the Great Hiatus, which, as you pointed out, is can be found in, oh gee, now I've lost my reference. Oh no, here it is.
Volume 1, number
Volume 1,
3.
number 3,
That's right.
1946 of the Baker Street Journal. And again, just to remind our listeners, one of the reasons why we do this is to look at a great piece of scholarship and enjoy it, but also think about whether or not you're persuaded by the argument and what you can learn from the technique used by Edgar Smith, because we need more people playing the game. And we hope you'll
Yes.
take up the typewriter, take up the computer keyboard, take up the pen, the pencil, the quill, whatever you choose to write with, and think about the cases of Sherlock Holmes and do your own development here. But we can start, I think, with the style, with what we love about Edgar Smith, who was, among other things, an executive at the General Motors Company, and you would not have thought that this was a suitable ground for a great literary stylist, but he really was. And he begins his style here with his approach to this case, Sherlock Holmes and the Great Hiatus, with a great touch here. It's a touch of common sense. He takes us immediately to the murder of the Honorable Ronald Adair, and then tells us that for 2 months and 28 days, of course, before Holmes returns to London to work on this, 2 years, 10 months, and 28 days, Holmes had been roving the face of the earth, denying knowledge of his existence to all but his brother Mycroft, and leaving even Watson and Mrs. Hudson to mourn him as dead. And when Holmes hears about the crime in Park Lane, by reason, says Edgar, of the so-called peculiar personal opportunities it seemed to offer, that hastened his decision and moved him to immediate action to return to London. But here's where the common sense comes in, because Edgar points out pretty mildly the motives for Holmes's deception in the matter of his absence from London will always be obscure. It's difficult for us to understand, particularly in light of events as we know them, why he went to the continent at all, and why, once he had safely disposed of the adversary who followed him there, the cruel myth of his own demise should have been permitted for so long to have tortured the faithful friend to whom he meant so much. And we know, what he said to Watson about the encounter with Moriarty. And, when you look at that, says Edgar, there are some questions there of time and distance and so on. But, says Edgar, wait a minute. Why did a big game hunter like Colonel Sebastian Moran hurl rocks at his foe from his place of safe concealment when an elephant gun or even a revolver in Ely's number 2 would have been useful? And then,
Well, yeah, but I want to pause on that for a moment, because it's not widely known. I mean, certainly we know in the empty house, Moran returns to London, and he, of course, murders Adair, and he attempts to murder what he thought was Sherlock Holmes. It was only the bust being rotated in the window, using an air gun by a blind German mechanic by the name of von Herder. Well, von Herder hadn't made his air gun at this point in the development of the stories in 1891. And it's actually not very widely known that Moran was actually using a prototype. It was von Herder's slingshot with those rocks.
Oh, that's a great story. I like that. Now there's a paper right there. Yeah, the German slingshot. I like that a lot. I wonder what slingshot is in German. Rock hurler. You'd need something to build it around.
It's a long word, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, so just to point out to our listeners, here we are just at the start of Edgar's essay. He's taken us right into common sense and said, wait a second, this guy throwing rocks doesn't make any sense. But he doesn't dwell any more on that. He says, look, if you want to talk about confusion, talk about the perplexities involved in Holmes' story about where he went from there. Because when Holmes comes to tell it, this is a tale compounded of fallacy, anachronism, and paradox. It's an itinerary that starts from the realm of the merely improbable and carries us swiftly to the never, never land of the globally impossible. It's a fantasy that rivals the imaginings of the most befuddled denizen of Upper Swandam Lane. The doings at the Reichenbach, we may all agree, are veiled in a mist of considerable doubt. But the years of the hiatus which lie beyond are enshrouded in a fog so thick that the streets of London itself have never known its like. And I wanted
And
to read that just so that we get this, I hope the listeners get a sense of the style of Edgar Smith,
yes,
the way he arranges these words.
he really was a master wordsmith. And in setting us up here, first of all, speaking of common sense, just 2 episodes ago, in episode 332, we talked about how not all of the pieces fit together in the final problem when Holmes was describing how he was keeping the police at bay and waiting until Monday for the arrest of Moriarty and the criminals, etc. There seem to be holes in the logic, and I think what Edgar is setting us up for here is to point out the holes in Holmes's story when he came back from the great hiatus and how he describes what he was doing. And he reminds us, he has a paragraph in here that's lifted directly from The Empty House, where Holmes recounts exactly where he's been. He said, I traveled for 2 years in Tibet, amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head lama. He said, I passed through Persia, looked in at Mecca, paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum. Returning to France, I spent some months in a research into the coal tar derivatives in a laboratory in Montpellier. And then he came over to London. So that's the itinerary of Sherlock Holmes during those 3 years. And Edgar... well, facts are stubborn things, and Edgar begins to pull the facts out and kind of narrate for us exactly what was going on in global world diplomacy and global events in the early to mid 1890s.
Yes, he does. And he quotes Watson. He says, as Watson once put it in appraisal of certain other things that Holmes had said, this is ineffable twaddle. We may take it for granted at the outset that Watson had not read of the remarkable explorations of any Norwegian named Sigerson in the fastnesses of Tibet, for the simple and preemptive reason that no Europeans, Norwegian or otherwise, came anywhere near the forbidden city of Lhasa until 1903. And then, as you point out, he tells us all of the details here. An Englishwoman, Miss Taylor, came to 150 miles of the Holy of Holies, and so on. Holmes, he says, there can be no confusion in any of this. Holmes was neither a woman nor a soldier, and we must be constrained now to believe that he was not even a Norwegian. The first 2 years of his reputed itinerary, therefore, we may dismiss as a figment.
Oh.
And then we take a look at Persia, and Edgar says, if he arrived early in the summer of 1893, he would have run into trouble in the form of a civil war. And, skipping all of that, Edgar says, and then next, says Edgar, as the Wanderjahr wore on, the German for Wanderjahr, wandering year wore on, the short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum. Now, the curious incident, says Edgar, in the year 1893 is that the Khalifa was not at Khartoum. That historic city on the banks of the Nile had been leveled to the ground in 1885 until Kitchener overthrew the Omdurman and returned the seat of Sudanese affairs once more to Khartoum. And how remarkable, says Edgar, that Watson didn't notice this, because the fall of Khartoum in 1885 was marked by the tragic death in the Battle of Chinese Gordon, General Gordon. And when we read the cardboard box, we know that a newly framed picture of General Gordon is hanging in Baker Street in that self-same year.
That's a dead giveaway right there. Watson should have figured that out. I guess he was just too enthralled with Holmes's return, too gobsmacked to be able to register the difference there, even in writing it up afterwards.
Yeah.
Wow. So he says, we must admit, having carried our explorations thus far, that Holmes's movements from that evening in the spring of 1891, when he turned his steps from the Reichenbach, to the summer of 1893, when he made his appearance at Montpellier, are less than satisfactorily accounted for. It is quite possible, even probable, that he should actually have found himself in the south of France when he did. For if he was to jump quickly over to London when the Park Lane homicide made such a move propitious, it is reasonable to suppose that he was somewhere close by, and where more likely, within the geographic limits imposed, than the home of his maternal ancestors. But Edgar wonders, where was he specifically in the latter part of 1891 and throughout 1892 and during the earlier months of 1893? So, Edgar then turns to the canon, kind of this internal source of records, and says, we know in The Dancing Men in 1898, Holmes made a reference to Wilson Hargreave of the New York Police Bureau, and that he spoke of his knowledge of the crooks of Chicago. And I love this. Such friendships and such knowledge are not credibly acquired on a mail-order basis.
Yeah, well done. And in both instances, the statements Holmes made have a ring of authority. He speaks eloquently of first-hand acquaintance and information. Well, this is where Edgar is introducing the alternative explanation. And we could tell our listeners two things. One is that, just to remind you, the Great Hiatus is generally thought to have occurred between 1891 and 1893 or 4. And everything we're hearing now about the Dancing Men took place in 1898. Even if you loathe chronology, that's really important. And the second thing we can tell you is that we will get deeper into this alternative explanation after this word from our sponsor.
In 2023, the BSI Press has added more titles to its roster that you won't want to miss. First up this year is the latest in the BSI Manuscript series, a title that takes you, maybe a moment to connect to the story, The Haven Horror. If you guessed The Adventure of the Retired Colorman, you're more clever than Josiah Amberley. This manuscript, once owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle and bequeathed to the British Museum, is a very clean one, coming as it did at the conclusion of the canon. But the essays that accompany it are wonderfully informative. Dan Andriaco looks at prostheses in the canon. The BSI's resident toxicologist Marina Stayich brings us into the realm of poisons. And our own Bert Wolder tells about the life of the artist Frank Wiles. These and more are colorful, just as colorful as the original story that acted as a metaphor and reality, and it treats the reader to a kaleidoscope of shades and hues that will provide hours of reading pleasure. Be sure to get your copy of The Haven Horror before it's sold out at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, I love a good cliffhanger. So, Bert, you left us on the precipice there, not of the Reichenbach Falls, but of where possibly Holmes could have found himself in late 1891 through early 1893.
Yes. Holmes has spoken in 1898 of his friend Wilson Hargreave of the New York Police Bureau. He has knowledge of the crooks of Chicago. He's familiar with recent criminological events, trends in the United States. And in the Red Circle in 1897, he's also deeply aware of the matter of Mr. Leverton's achievements in the Long Island Cave mystery. a minor affair that the British press had given little, if any, notice. So, what happened here? How did he acquire this firsthand knowledge? Well, Edgar says if Holmes made this interim visit to the United States, which seems quite likely, we know it could have not have been during any of the years of his active practice up to 1891, when the Great Hiatus began, because he never neglected the practice to the point of leaving London. It's altogether reasonable, too, that Holmes should have chosen the United States in preference to Tibet as a place in which to lie low, while events in London were shaping their course for whatever reasons. He could have kept an eye on developments there to much better advantage from the States. Mycroft could have reached him if an emergency arose. And it's far easier to drop out of sight in New York than it is in Lhasa, and far more interesting.
I love that. I love that observation, because he would have stuck out like a sore thumb in Lhasa, but in the great metropolis of New York, he could have easily faded right into the wallpaper. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, he said he must have come to know Hargreave well, between whatever little monographs or brochures he may have been writing to pass the time away. And he was probably called in for a consultation, to a degree justifying his notice. And, of course, crime reared its ugly head while he was there.
Yes. Now bear in mind where we are here. Edgar began with some common sense. None of this makes any sense, the actions of Moran. And Holmes' travels don't make any sense. And so he's introduced an alternative explanation, and he said, it would have made more sense for Holmes to be in the States. He's got knowledge of all of these things. When else could he have acquired it? Well, what would he have done? What would Holmes have done in the States around that time? Edgar says, there occurred on the 4th of August in the year 1892 in the town of Fall River in the stately Commonwealth of Massachusetts, an event so blood-drenched and horrendous and altogether surpassing in its shivering magnificence that the vendetta, the gang-slangs, and the creme passionnels of the metropolis seemed almost like philanthropy beside it. Because on the hot morning of that day, a certain Andrew Jackson Borden and his wife Abby Dufree Borden were done fulsomely to death in the sanctity of their own castle by a sharp-edged instrument generally assumed to have been a hatchet.
Oh, boy. Good old Lizzie Borden.
Yes.
And her trial came to the Bristol County Court on June 5th, 1893. She had been indicted, I think, in December of the previous year. I was held by the grand jury and indicted December 2nd, 1892. So, and I love Edgar's observation. So far as can be determined at this late date, only 15 people in the United States really believed Lizzie Borden innocent. Her 2 pastors, the editor of the Boston Journal, and most importantly, the 12 jurors at her trial. Doesn't even say whether her lawyer did. But this was a case of her guilt not being able to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And the police investigation was horrific in this case. It got off to a bad start. Edgar writes, most members of the force were away on a clam bake. And then later on, 2 private detectives. That's how you know it was in the outskirts of Boston, because they were on a clam bake. Later on, 2 private detectives were called in on the case. One of them was from the Boston office of Pinkerton's. He turned out to be a very inferior fellow indeed. The other, Edwin D. McHenry, was by all accounts that have survived a miserable bungler. But despite the best efforts of these men, despite all the other official and unofficial ineptness which the investigation was conducted, the first confusions were overcome, the net closed swiftly, evidence accumulated, and then, of course, came the indictment. So, you've got all of this bungling police work. They do get their woman as far as being able to bring her to court, but it was not a slam dunk case, as we saw. It was all circumstantial evidence, and we know what Sherlock Holmes said of circumstantial evidence. But here's the problem, and I think Edgar presents this. It's this, in this frustration of justice, he writes, perhaps that we may find our keynote to the problem of the great hiatus and to Holmes's evasions and, oh, here's one, tergiversation concerning it. So Holmes basically needed to remain undercover during this time. He was not ready to return from the hiatus. So to identify himself in the Fall River area as Sherlock Holmes, he would have blown his cover. So that's one thing. He worked in secrecy during this time. But we also know, Edgar writes, that in the Five Orange Pips in 1888, Holmes admitted to being beaten 3 times by men and once by a woman. Okay? And he says, we may doubt his proud, unbending nature as we do, that Holmes would have admitted his defeat even by the woman if Watson himself had not been witness to it. And this defeat, in any event, will be recalled, was a small private matter. But to admit defeat by a second woman, this time a plain, dull, and wholly uninspiring spinster charged with a double-distilled, spine-chilling axe murder, which had the whole world laying awake at nights, that would be more than Holmes's egotism could bear. To acknowledge that he had been in the United States when the crime occurred would have been to imply inevitably his involvement in the investigations which followed, or alternatively to convey that his powers were so lightly thought of that he never had been consulted. Neither of these prospects, we may believe, carried very strong appeal.
Just wonderful. So what Edgar's done is he's taken us with his common sense through these bizarre events, given us an alternative explanation, put Holmes in the United States, and then identified this as a yet unrecorded defeat of Sherlock Holmes. How wonderful.
And so, of course, he had to cover it up.
Yeah, and so instead of New York and Chicago and Fall River, Massachusetts, Holmes spun his yarn of Lhasa and Tibet and Mecca and Khartoum, and Watson, innocent that he was, swallowed it whole and passed it on to the world. And then Edgar closes. It's just wonderful. This is a time, in the 1940s, and of course Edgar was born in the 19th century. But the familiarity with people like Goethe, he closes with a couple of quotes from Goethe. He says, we can't blame Watson, nor should we blame Sherlock Holmes. He says, remember the quote from Goethe, "Wer Sinn gewöhnt das Dimension," which is sort of where we are used to see that man mocks what he never understands or comprehends. "Wer Sinn gewöhnt das die Menschen verhöhnen, was sie nicht verstehen." And we have to remember, too, that Holmes could not, great man though he was, have admitted to being in 2 places at once. Schäle das die Natur einen Mensch aus dich, which is nature made only one being out of you, but there was enough material for a good man and a villain, or a rogue, I guess.
So we could have had Schrodinger's Sherlock. If that's the case, as long as we're sticking with the German here.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, we mustn't lift the box to see what's really in there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, speaking, since there is this German theme running through this episode, I just wanted to close out our earlier inquiry that slingshot in German is Steinschleuder.
Oh, I used to know a Leonard Steinschleuder. Now I know why he always looked so askance at Oktoberfest.
He was tired of people throwing rocks at him.
Yeah, that's great. Steinschleuder.
Well, I guess until the next time we meet, this will continue to remain just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles.
Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Once again, Mr. Sherlock Holmes is free to devote his life to examining those interesting little problems which the complex life of London so plentifully presents. Mr. Sherlock Holmes.